you'll see a little note. You might see a little message on your screen. So I want to welcome everybody to the inaugural lecture of the Danielsen Institute Speaker Series. And so I'm going to tell you just very briefly something about the Danielsen Institute and also about the speaker series, and then introduce our very distinguished speaker. I'm Usha Tumalanara. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm the director. I'm very new to the Danielsen Institute. I came in January, but I am the director of community-based education at the Danielsen Institute, and also a research professor in psychological and brain sciences at Boston University. And I'm delighted to welcome all of you here. So for those of you who are joining from outside of the Danielsen Institute, I want to just share briefly who we are. The Albert and Jessie Danielsen Institute at Boston University is comprised of an outpatient community mental health clinic, clinical and research training programs, and the Center for the Study of Religion and Psychology. And we have a commitment to excellence in clinical care, training, research, community education now, which is our newest branch, and also the interdisciplinary exploration of spirituality and mental health. The Institute is honored to host a new speaker series with distinguished speakers on topics related to mental health, with an emphasis on suffering, resilience, well-being, diversity of background and perspective, and social justice. And so we are thrilled that our inaugural speaker is Dr. Judith Herman. I'm going to say just a very brief introduction to our speaker because we want to use this time to hear from her. Dr. Judith Lewis Herman is a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. For 30 years, until she retired, she was the director of training at the Victims of Violence program at the Cambridge Hospital in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is now Cambridge Health Alliance. Dr. Herman is the author of 2 award-winning books, the first being Father-Daughter Incest, which was published by Harvard University Press in 1981, and the second being Trauma and Recovery, which was published first in 1992 by Basic Books. She is the recipient of numerous awards, including the 1996 Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, ISTSS. In 2007, she was named a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. Her book, Trauma and Recovery, is among the most influential scholarly works on trauma that has revolutionized how we conceptualize trauma and traumatic stress. I refer to Dr. Herman's book as the essential book on trauma. And if anyone wants to truly understand what traumatic stress feels like, this is a critical read. Dr. Herman's work has inspired new generations of mental health practitioners, researchers, educators, and activists. I also want to share more personally that I've had the honor of being supervised by Judy when I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Victims of Violence program at the Cambridge Hospital in the mid-1990s. Being supervised by Judy was transformative in so many ways for me as a clinician, as an early career woman psychologist navigating my career and later my family life. So I feel truly fortunate to have known Judy all of these years as a mentor, colleague, and dear friend. I'm also deeply grateful that she accepted our invitation today. Today, she's going to be talking about how survivors envision justice. And I can't say that this is a more timely topic on so many levels as we are all grappling with enormous chaos and trauma nationally and globally. So it is my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Judith Herman. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Usha. I am honored to, there's a Yiddish word, kvel, which means overflowing like a fountain. And we kvel about our children, of course, and our grandchildren, and all the people that have studied with us and worked with us and gone on to have their own distinguished careers. So I'm honored to be here and to have you ask me. I'm going to talk today about an idea that that's been kind of churning around in my mind for 20 years or so. But during the pandemic, when I was pretty much in solitary confinement anyway, and as I was about to turn 80, I decided it was now or never. And so this is the book that I'm working on at the moment. And it's due out early next year from Basic Books. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, here we go. So the working title of the book is Truth and Repair. And it's about justice and what it might look like if anybody ever bothered to ask survivors what they wanted, which turns out hardly ever happens. What I did was listen to survivors. It's pretty much what I've been doing all my life, or at least all my professional life. I suppose in a way, all my life, because a lot of my early memories involve talk about visas and how to get people out of Hungary and Poland and places like that. I interviewed 30 people. I can't say it's a representative sample because it's what's called a convenience sample. Just I put out the word, any survivors who'd like to talk to me about their experiences with the justice system, if they actually reported the crimes against them, and most of them, of course, did not. So it's a pretty diverse group in terms of social class, geographic background, ethnic background, religious background, but my sample was more highly educated than the average, with a lot of people surprised, given that it's just a social network, a lot of people in various professions, and a lot of people who had what Robert J. Lifton calls a survivor mission, people who made meaning out of their trauma by going on to try to help other survivors. So here's what I learned. The social conception that I've developed to understand trauma in its various manifestations, whether it's the interpersonal trauma that goes on in families or the trauma that goes on in warfare, is that there are two basic forms of social organization, one that I call tyranny and one that I call mutuality. And here are the rules, the basic rules of tyranny. And these are the rules of conquest, of genocide, of ethnic cleansing, of colonialism. There are also the rules of the sex industry, the rules of many cults, and the rules that pertain in many families. I'm going to talk a lot, not just about the perpetrators and the victims, but about the bystanders and the broken relationship between the victims and the bystanders. And under this form of social organization, my argument is that there is no such thing as justice. There might be courts, there might be laws, but there's no justice. And I think I take patriarchy as my sort of exhibit A, if you will, because I think both in terms of long duration and worldwide domination, we see this worldwide. We've now, only in the last 30 years since Beijing, since the International Women's Conference in Beijing, we now have a human rights special rapporteur on violence against women. And so here's a report from 20 years ago about both the prevalence of violence against women and the fact that it is not epidemic, but endemic in most societies. And it is a crime of impunity. In the US, these are data from the 1990s, but I could show you pretty much the same exponential decay curve with more recent data. I just didn't update the slide because it would look the same. Somewhere around a quarter of sexual assaults, and that's a generous estimate, are reported to police. Most, maybe half of those result in arrest. And then, as you see, by the time you get to cases that are actually accepted for prosecution in the criminal justice system, it is not the victim who initiates charges, but the prosecutor, and they have to decide whether they think this is a case they can win, because they're judged on their success rate in getting convictions. So, if it's that very rare case where a Black stranger rapes a young, blonde, virginal white woman, that one will be prosecuted for sure. But most cases are not like that. Most white women are raped by white men who they know. God forbid she was on a date, God forbid she had a drink. And anyway, what was she wearing? And, pretty much, the social, a lot of women who report to the police say that basically they feel that they were treated as the perpetrator rather than the victim. And so few are prosecuted. Most of those, a good percentage of those that are actually prosecuted result in conviction. But by the time you get down to a prison sentence, you're 5% or under. Some estimates go as low as 0 to 1%. So that's impunity. And so from the point of view of, and I could show you similar data for child sexual abuse and for domestic violence. And so the victims, whatever trust the victims had in their community to defend them when they are hurt, that trust is broken. I contrast the rules of charity with the rules of mutuality. I would say equality, because in most political theory, the foundations of justice are equality. But there are many relationships, parent-child being the most extreme, I would guess, where the two parties don't have equal power, can't possibly have equal power. therapeutic relationships are like that. But they can be relationships of mutuality, of give and take, of shared voice, shared consent, and fairness. And it's amazing to me, one of the things that's always amazed me is how survivors of horrible childhood abuse or horrible of torture, of imprisonment, somehow preserve their sense of fairness. They have a concept of fairness, even if they haven't experienced it. And what they're looking for is respect and voice and consent. So actually, that's pretty much what my survivor informants told me. So, if you want one slide to sum it up, here it is. There's a legal theorist named Ross London who came to this work after his experience as a prosecutor, a defense attorney, and a judge, who basically ended up having deep experience of our justice system, felt there's got to be something better. And he wrote a book called Crime, Punishment, and Restorative Justice, thinking about how restorative justice ideas might be integrated into the existing legal system so that it would be fairer to everyone. And he based his sort of political philosophy on the idea of a moral community, which comes out of sort of research on the psychology of altruism, and talks about the moral community as a community to which everyone belongs, and a community that makes rules that are fair to all, and then is responsible for holding people accountable when those rules are violated. So, and he speaks of basic trust. This is a psychological idea that comes from Erik Erikson and from all the work that has been done since on attachment. But he sees it as a political idea about social justice based on mutual trust. And here's a quote from Ross London. He talks about the idea of a private misfortune, and this is, of course, for particularly for victims of patriarchal violence who are shamed and blamed, who often never tell anyone. It's their private misfortune. The moral community doesn't rally to take care of the victim, but rather ostracizes or blames the victim. And this is true of subordinated groups generally, not just of women and children and girls, but children in particular. And so here are some examples of feeling betrayed by the moral community. Family, first of all. Talk about being ostracized, that they, being asked not to go to a wedding because they really didn't want to deal, they chose to include the perpetrator rather than the victim. And that she felt was more devastating to her than the actual abuse. And here is a quote from a rape survivor who did report to police after she was raped. I think this was freshman week, which, by the way, is a time of maximum vulnerability. Both, the 18 to 24 age bracket is the highest risk. Second is 12 to 17, and third is under 12. But she reported to the police, and the DA declined to press charges because she'd had a drink. And from another survivor who I interviewed, this is a survivor of domestic violence. She wanted a restraining order, and she wanted basically she wanted some reparations because she was poor, and it was her ex-husband who had all the money, and she said basically forget about justice because it's not in your hands. So let me just based on what we know about post-traumatic stress, there's a way in which you could, if you actually tried to design a system for exacerbating symptoms of post-traumatic stress, the justice system would be a pretty good exhibit A, because the things that victims need in the aftermath for their recovery are, a sense of being safe, but a lot of people, especially if they've been subjected to coercive control over any period of time, like battered women or abused kids, they've been threatened. That they may have well been threatened. If you accuse me, I'll come after you, I'll kill the kids, I'll kill the dog, I'll kill your parents. I'll send or even if you get me locked up, I'll send my friends. They'll, So increased risk, and then in an adversarial system where the accused is, has the right to confront his accuser, and the presumption of innocence, none of which anybody wants to mess with. But the accuser is going to be shamed and blamed, and once again, it didn't happen. She's lying. She's crazy. She brought it upon herself. She asked for it, and so on. She's going to be humiliated once again. She does not have any say over the system. Is basically a bunch of obscure rules that most people have no familiarity with and no agency. Even in civil court, where the victim does have agency to bring charges, then there are all these procedures that are opaque to most citizens. No chance to just tell the story. It's been a big controversial move over the past couple of decades to allow victims to prepare what's called an impact statement only in front of a judge after a conviction has happened. And even that has been, just allowing victims that much participation has been very controversial. Oh, they'll want revenge, they'll sway the judges to be more harsh. None of that has turned out to be true, but, and then finally, what most victims would like is to prevent this from happening again. But the outcome that the system offers is punishment or money in civil trials. And so for a lot of victims, it's not worth going through this because the outcome isn't really going to satisfy them. Okay, so what would satisfy them? Let's see how we're doing. I've highlighted in red the three themes that were unanimously endorsed by all my informants. They wanted the truth out there first and foremost, and not just the facts, but the facts of the harm. Because, if all the other defenses of the perpetrator fail, then he'll fall back on, well, but it's time to, no big deal. She has no sense of humor. She's just out for money. She's just out for no, attention. And it's time to move on. So she wants that moral community to vindicate her. She wants the burden of shame lifted from her shoulders and put on the shoulders of the perpetrator where it belongs. And I'm by the way, I'm saying she because that's the most common situation, but there are male victims as well of sexual assault, child abuse. Most of the perpetrators in those cases are male, and that adds an extra level of shame for male victims because they are unmanned. Often victims who are raped are called, "You're my bitch, you're my pussy, you're not a, your manhood is taken from you." Because women are supposed to be subordinated, so we don't lose our femininity if this happens to us. But with conventional notions of masculinity, subordination, sexual subordination is doubly shaming. So those were the three things that everybody wanted. People were mixed about issues of apology. Not everybody mentioned the issues highlighted in blue, but quite a few people did. Especially the prevention of future harm and the exposure of the offender. Punishment, revenge, and forgiveness I put with question marks because not that many people were in favor of any of these three, even though those were things that I asked specifically about because though most of the interview was unstructured, I really wanted to hear people's views on what is on these aspects of justice. So here are some quotes about acknowledgement. She just said, this is what he did to another human being. And a lot of survivors mentioned they just wanted their humanity recognized. Oh, and they wanted acknowledgement, not just from the perpetrator or not even primarily from the perpetrator, but from the community. They wanted the community to acknowledge the truth, to hear them, and to say to them, that was wrong, that should not have happened, you're not to blame. And we will do what we need to do to protect you and to prevent this from happening. This is another survivor she was basically trafficked by her father, who was also an abuser. By the way, for him, she felt she thought he should be locked up because he was so dangerous. But the sex buyers, she grew up in Appalachia. Her father would drug her, bring her to a truck stop where the truckers would and pimp her out, basically. And she didn't want to have anything to do with them. But again, she's saying, I'm a human being. And she wants them exposed. She wants their moral communities to know. And she started with her family. She also talked about how this is an endemic crime. You're supposed to, take the abuse and like it. And, this happens all the time. And this needs to, she envisioned a tribunal, a truth commission where victims would testify. Again, Julie Coultier, who after her case was turned down for criminal charges, she did sue in criminal court for damages. And she said he was going to have to tell his family. Now, most civil suits are settled out of court with a sum of money and a non-disclosure agreement made famous by our former president. In the pedophile ring that was run within the Catholic Church, this is how the church dealt with it for years. Suits with, settling with a lot of money and a non-disclosure agreement and transferring the priest to another parish. That's when we talk about endemic, that's the kind of thing we mean. And so this brave young woman said, no non-disclosure agreement. Similarly, Ross Chait, who's now a professor of political science and law at Brown, who was abused at a summer camp for the boys who were in the San Francisco Boys Choir. Again, his case, there were several survivors who came forward, but it was too late to press criminal charges. So he pressed civil charges. The perpetrator defaulted, didn't show up in court, which meant he basically skipped town. So the case was automatically adjudicated in his favor, in the victim's favor, but because in order to determine the sum of money that was the fine that was imposed, or the damages that were imposed, he had to testify in court. Now, he never saw a dollar of that money, but he said it meant a lot to him because he said, the idea of money is important. It shows that I was valued. And it's the vindication that mattered to him. Now, when it comes to revenge, this is artwork by another rape survivor. She, again, her case was turned down for criminal prosecution because this was a man she dated. She's an artist. He invited her over to his apartment after they'd broken up to retrieve artwork that she'd given him or loaned him. And he raped her when she showed up as punishment for breaking up with him. She had a lot of nightmares and also about the rape. And also she talked about a nightmare she had where a dinosaur came and trampled on him and she was gleeful. And also actual nightmares where she shot him. When she was awake, she was horrified. The last thing she wanted in her life was more violence. And so here she's showing both her fantasy of shooting the rapist and her tears for all the gunshot victims. And these are all the gunshot victims over, I don't know how many years, but not many, in Boston. Her husband was not as conflicted about his revenge fantasy. He was a veteran and an attorney, and he was very much in fight mode and wanted to, said it was the rapist who he considered inhuman. But then I asked him, well, what would happen if he apologized? And he kind of did it, it was like a light bulb went off, and just the idea that if he would apologize, that would make a huge difference to him. He wouldn't feel so vengeful. And that's the kind of magic of apologies, when they're genuine, when they're sincere, when in these rare instances where offenders are actually remorseful and have had a change of heart and want to make amends. People say their rage and their revenge fantasies just vanish. Eve Ensler, who some of you may have seen, her play The Vagina Monologues, or her V-Day play. At Victims of Violence program, we once put on a staging of V-Day. She wrote a whole, basically, monologue in the persona of her father, who had died and had never apologized to her, but she fantasized a genuine apology. And she said this was like an alchemy that that just released all her rage and bitterness, and allowed her to forgive him. And once she'd written this play, she renamed herself as V. She didn't want to use the patronymic any longer. And the last words of her book, The Apology, are "Old man, be gone." She felt he wasn't living inside her anymore. And she's recommending this as a kind of therapy. But where true apologies are so uplifting, nobody wants the politician's apology. I'm sorry if anybody was, if anybody was harmed, not all the conditional and the passive voice, not I'm sorry I did this to you and I will, what can I do to make amends? The brother who abused her, she said, if he talked about it, she'd just feel slimed all over again. And then her family would want her to forgive. And so that's the problem. It's a lot easier for the moral community to pressure survivors for forgiveness than it is to actually hold perpetrators accountable. So another of my informants talked about the fact that she didn't want a one-to-one encounter with her. She's a very devout Christian. And actually, but she testified against him in court. He was convicted. He died in prison. She actually attended his funeral, staying outside in the parking lot so that the family wouldn't be disturbed by her presence, but praying for him. She said she couldn't pray for him for a long time, but she hoped that he would find some kind of relationship with divinity. But she never wanted, reconciliation was not what she wanted. And I think the majority of my informants did not want any kind of one-to-one encounter with their perpetrators. Another of my informants, who's a Protestant minister, talked about, let's not, sometimes it's not the Christian thing is not to forgive, because that actually it enables the perpetrator. It's not the right thing for the moral community to be doing. She says, yes, I know we're supposed to teach about turning the other cheek. And then she quoted one of the survivors she counseled as saying, I turn the other cheek and I turn the other cheek and now I have no face left. So she was challenging the moral community to think about what to do to rehabilitate perpetrators. And the truth is, we don't know how to do that. We've invested so much in punishment and so little in rehabilitation that we don't know how to do it. I mean, the only offender treatment that we've got is for convicted offenders who represent our very unrepresentative sample, given the epidemiology that I've described to you. And even there, the outcome data are not very impressive. So here's another of my informants talking about why she did press charges. This was a boy who, from a classmate whose family had a lot of money, who raped her at a party. And she found out that this, she wasn't the first of his victims. And she said, one of the reasons she went forward was thinking if somebody had done this before, then had gone through with it, that maybe this would never have happened to me. And her family was supportive. Her dad hung up on, but this is how these cases are often resolved. And she questioned whether, repeat offenders, whether we have the tools for rehabilitation, and she's right to do so. People also, see how we're doing on time. Okay, we have 10 minutes. In civil court, the remedy is money. Here's a quote from someone who was abused both in childhood and then sexually harassed by a notorious repeat offender when she was a grad student at Harvard and dropped out and never got her doctorate. The perpetrator was finally, after 18 people came forward in a few years ago. He was finally disciplined and found it prudent to take early retirement. But she talks about trauma being a life sentence, and she didn't want money from the perpetrator. But she thought Harvard should be accountable for enabling a perpetrator for 30 years. The cases that came forward were over a period from the 1990s to 2015 or so. Yes, and the perpetrators also should contribute to a fund that would take care of survivors, because she didn't want it coming from the perpetrator directly to her. It would feel like dirty money. And a lot of survivors talked about that. Amy Bradford, whose artwork I showed you, she wanted the perpetrator to give $30 to the Rape Crisis Center, not to her. And it represented the 30 pieces of silver for which Judas betrayed Jesus in her mind. He had much more money than that, but she didn't care. There is such a thing. It actually was passed during the Reagan era as a, but I think of it as a very progressive piece of legislation, because it has created a fund not out of taxpayer money, but out of fines on offenders, so that they have to give back to the community and to other victims. And it has become a major source of funding, both for restitution to victims, reparations for their medical expenses and so on, time lost from work, all of that. But for victim advocacy services in the courts and making the courts less forbidding for survivors, and for supporting grassroots rape crisis centers, battered women's shelters, and the
Oh,
victim
thanks.
survivors.
It's Haitian
Sorry
Heritage.
about that. If whoever has their
Yeah,
microphone
yeah.
on, please
Please
yourself.
mute yourselves, folks.
Yes, please mute. I'm going to try to mute you, but please do mute your microphones.
It's not well, this model is not well known, and it's not widely replicated in other countries, but I think of it as a very useful and I do think that taxpayer money could be contributed as well. The antidote to this kind of trauma is being embraced by the community. And we, at the Victims of Violence program, we were very keen on group groups for survivors, and we developed a lot of group models, a couple of which have been published. Because we thought of groups as a bridge to out of isolation and into a feeling of new community. And so here's the testimony from one of we interviewed people 6 months later or a year later to see how they were doing. The groups really speed up recovery on many dimensions of whether we're measuring depression, PTSD, or other aspects of trauma. And the survivor talks about how she could finally extend the compassion that she felt for other group members to herself. And we actually challenge people to do that in the group, because a lot of times they're very caring toward the other group members. They don't shame them, they don't blame them. But they said, but I'm different because I did this or I did that, or my story is worse, or until all the secrets are unburdened. I went back, I kept going back to the perpetrator. This is a childhood abuse survivor. Until their secrets are unburdened and they're embraced by the community, they don't feel that sense of healing. And so the groups are a bridge to a larger community. But as I've talked about being embraced, survivors being embraced by the larger community, it seems to me that justice is part of that. And that without social justice, trauma is a social problem, abuse is a social problem. And without social recognition, truth and repair, healing is not complete. This is just a lovely quote from the late British philosopher Bernard Williams, who talks about people sharing not helpless rage, but righteous indignation, since this was wrong. And that's, he talks about binding people together in a community of feeling, or what Ross London would call a moral community. So here's the Office for Victims of Crime in the US Justice Department now sponsors, since the Victims of Crime Act was passed, they sponsor a National Crime Victims' Rights Week, and talking about bringing honor to victims. This was from 20 years ago. But this has continued to be honored every year. And so you see in this poster some of the things that mean justice to survivors: voice, choices, information, restitution, safety, advocacy, support, respect. And finally, I'll close with a wonderful story that was told to me by one of my informants for this new book. Her name is Sarah Super. She is a rape survivor and a community organizer. And she, like the artist that I showed you, Amy Bradford, was also raped by an ex-boyfriend as punishment for breaking up with him. He broke into her apartment and raped her at knife point. And she did press charges and he was convicted. She was able to escape after by saying she had to go to the bathroom, and she ran out of the apartment, screamed, people came, the police came. She was very well treated by the justice system. He was convicted, he is in prison. she felt vindicated, and that, I mean, she's very ambivalent about prison, period, but she felt like this guy was dangerous and she was afraid of him. And she felt like she hoped he was getting rehabilitated in prison, but meantime, she thought he belonged there. But what she felt very, and her parents were very supportive, but the progressive community that she belonged to didn't really rally to her support. Even after she came out in public, she just felt like there was a silence. And in fact, his family, the perpetrator's family, thought he was the victim because he was being criminally charged. They had a GoFundMe page to pay his expenses. And she saw how their community was fractured by this incident. And so, and she read Trauma and Recovery, and there's a part in there where I compare combat and rape as initiation rites for young men and young women, right? And the importance of the various war memorials, especially the Vietnam War Memorial, as a place for pilgrimage and mourning, and where a lot of combat veterans come to feel connected to others and to be validated and recognized. And I wrote that there's no public memorial for rape survivors. So Sarah Super decided that she needed to build one. And so she did. She got it organized. She went to her, she lives in Minneapolis. She went to her city council person who sent her to the Parks Department. And though she hadn't heard from anything from the abuser's family or from many people she knew, she'd heard from dozens and dozens of rape victims who said, it happened to me too. I never told anyone. I thought it was my fault. So she brought them with her to the park when she was invited to give a 3-minute talk to the Parks Department. And she got it done. So this is a photo from the, it's a big sort of open circular space, a public square, if you will, in a park. It's quite beautiful. There are these lighted pillars that are decorated with mosaics, showing a sort of progression from an isolated victim who's embraced by the community and stands up and testifies. And it was inaugurated in 2020. Sarah sees it as a place for public education and testimony and healing. So and just as in some ways the what's now called popularly called the Lynching Museum in Alabama is, a memorial to the 400 some victims of white supremacist terrorist murder. We just saw another example of that this past weekend. This is a form of justice. This was Brian Stevenson's expanding the idea of justice to public acknowledgement of respect and value and and restitution for survivors. So let me stop there. And the floor is open for, questions, comments, speeches.
Thank you,
Thank
Judy.
you.
Thank you so much, Judy. This was always, every time I listen to you, it always just brings me back to what matters the most and why the purpose of our work and why we try to do the healing work that we're all trying to be engaged with. So thank you so much. I want to just open it up for questions, comments, anything that you'd like to share. You can either, I'll be monitoring the chat for questions if you want to put it in there, or you could just raise your hand. If you could use your raise hand function, that would make it easier for me to see who's.
And I'll be listening. I'm just going to go heat up my tea for a second.
Okay. Okay. I think we have a hand up from Alan Tanner. Hi, Alan. Go ahead.
Yes. I was wondering, so for the individual mentioned earlier that was able to have a kind of successful process with her case going through the justice system, who you mentioned was also a community organizer.
Yeah.
In order for the justice system to act in the way they did, was that their immediate response to be positive and receptive to what she said, or did she have to do organizing in order to push them to be receptive?
No, she didn't have to do organizing, but she attributed the fact that she was well treated to the fact that she lived in that she's white, blonde, and lived in an affluent community. So she said I was, the perfect victim. And her boyfriend was captured after a high-speed chase. She said she thought the police treated him very well too, and she wondered what would have happened to him if he were Black.
I see. Thank you.
It's a great question. So there's a question in the chat from Leah. Would love to hear about some of the most effective methods you saw work in trauma groups, in your trauma groups, and generally, what did they look like?
Great question. I love to talk about groups. We have different sorts of groups depending on whether people are in early recovery, what we call the safety stage, or the middle stage of recovery, which is more focused on really going into depth in sharing the trauma story. In the early stages of recovery, the groups are very present focused. It's not that people don't talk about the trauma. We're not silencing them, but the focus is more on the impact of the trauma on their daily life. And so our early recovery group that we offered most frequently is called the Trauma Information Group. It's a 10-session group. There's a topic for each session. And the way we work is, and there's a worksheet for each session. The first one is what is PTSD. The second one is safety and self-care, and so on. There's one on shame, there's one on anger, there's one on relationships, there's one on the recovery process, and the last one is on making meaning out of your trauma. And each time we have a worksheet that's a couple of pages with a lot of information. If everybody in the group can read, we pass it around and somebody will read a paragraph. and then everybody discusses. So it's sort of like, I think talking about, for example, the numbing and freezing and dissociative symptoms of trauma. A lot of people think, oh my God, I left my body and I saw what was happening from outside my body. And now I hear, the voice inside my head, screaming at me. I must be crazy. No, that doesn't mean you're crazy. That's part of PTSD, complex PTSD. So people will say, yeah, that happened to me too, or that, but they don't go into a lot of detail. And people bond around how to take care of themselves in the present, and they share a lot. I mean, I remember one group where somebody shared she was HIV positive. I mean, someone shared that she'd been trafficked. I mean, things that people don't usually volunteer. And a lot of our other early stage groups are, we had a yoga group, we have a group called Healthy Relationships, we have a group, one of our staff members led a gardening group, and they created a sort of a peace garden. And then our second stage group, where people really do go into detail and tell their stories, is for people who have, who have now a stable enough life in the present and a safe enough life in the present, so that they can revisit the past from a sense that that was then, this is now, and I can really feel the difference. And that group is also time limited, usually 16 weeks. We've had all women's groups, all men's groups, and co-ed groups. And what we do there is the work is organized around a goal. People don't just tell their stories for exposure's sake. They tell it in the service of mastery. Let's think about something that that would be a goal for you if you felt you didn't have to do it alone, but you had the support of other people. And people have in-group goals like I just want to tell my story and not leave my body, or out-of-group goals like I just want to tell my husband, or I just want to tell my mother or my sister or my brother. And then, or sometimes we don't expect people to know right away what their goal is going to be, but to use the early part of the group to refine their goals, define and refine. And so they have to tell a lot of their story for the personal goal to make sense. I mean, somebody might want to just, the goal might end up being just being able to walk out of the room when her boss is telling dirty jokes. But in order for that to make sense, she's got to talk about what happened to her. And then the later stage of the goal, people come in and they report. At the later stage of the group, people actually achieve their goals. And I mean, we make sure they're defined as limited enough so that it can be done in 16 weeks. So if someone just says, well, I want to have more intimacy in my life and better sex life and a better job and, more friends and so on, we say, we all want that, but, let's narrow it down a little bit. So those are the models. and people take turns sharing and getting support.
Thank you, Judy. I have a question that came in directly to me. How do you take care of yourself while listening, as you listen to these stories?
Very important question. And there's a very simple answer. Don't do it alone. Never do it alone. Don't do this work alone. I mean, what's kept me going all these years, besides seeing people recover, which is, you know, I mean, I talked about Quelling at the beginning, but, you know, it's so inspiring. I just, you know, if you're going to hear the worst of what human beings do to one another, then you have to sort of surround yourself with the best. And, you know, that's why I keep talking about the Victims of Violence program, because, you know, I mean, we were kind of family, you know, and that just, I mean, we just bonded. And, you know, you need colleagues. If you're in an environment, if you're in a solo practice, you need a peer support group or supervision, or, you know, some kind of connection with other people where you can just go and say it. You're not going to believe what you know, because you think you've heard it all, and then somebody's going to tell you something that just, you know, makes you want to tear your hair out. So, so yes, don't do it alone.
Thank you, Judy. It's such a great point. I can attest to that. The Victims of Violence program feeling like a family and being a family. I couldn't imagine working with survivors of complex trauma without that support that I certainly felt 25 years ago, and learning the importance of that. Okay, so here is another question from George Stavros. This is in reference to the article that you had sent to me to share with our Danielsen Institute colleagues. So from the article, many of the survivors talked about wanting to be freed of the oppressive burden of anger, indignation, and outrage. Any thoughts about the usefulness of therapy, group or individual, or rituals to help with this specific part of the experience of sexual trauma?
Well, I think groups are wonderful for that, because, and that's why we have an anger topic in the trauma information group and in the trauma recovery group. Oftentimes, well, it's interesting. In the women's groups, people bond initially around their sense of fear and helplessness and shame, and then only later start confessing to their anger and their revenge fantasies. And, you know, this is one of their dirty secrets. I mean, a lot of people just feel almost as though the viciousness and hate of the perpetrator is now like a foreign body, and they wish they could like vomit it out. But then they start sharing their fantasies, and what they find is that other people have these fantasies too, and they're ashamed of them. And they start to embellish one another's fantasies, you know, and sort of make them more and more grotesque. And then they start laughing, you know, and pretty soon they're just roaring with laughter and tears are coming down. It's, you know, they're funny. I mean, George Orwell has a wonderful essay called Revenge is Sour. And he talks about how he said, who wouldn't have, how revenge is something you want when you're isolated and helpless, but when it be actually, and humiliated. But when you can actually do, when you actually have the possibility of doing it, then it just becomes disgusting. And he had a wonderful quote. He said, who wouldn't have been overjoyed to see the members of the SS beaten and, stripped and beaten and tortured during the war. But then, when it becomes now it's pointless. And so the pointlessness of it, and the once the person isn't isolated and helpless anymore, it becomes kind of grotesque and funny.
Thank you, Judy. One more question that we have in the chat from Shelley Rambo. How do you position your use of the term recovery in relationship to the language of resilience? How are they related?
Well, there's this, resilience has become something of a buzzword lately, so I'm not that crazy about it anymore, because I think it's used very indiscriminately. But there's a very interesting study that came out of what's Grady Hospital in Atlanta, with a very, high risk inner city population, very multiply traumatized. And the way they find recovery was having had a history of PTSD, but no longer having the diagnosis, versus resilience, being exposed to trauma, but never developing PTSD. That was their definition. And interestingly, having a sense of mastery was associated with recovery, and having a set of being active, having a sense of there's something you could do, you're not helpless, and having a sense of mastery and purpose in life were associated with resilience.
Thank you. Are there other questions, comments? Please feel free to raise your hand, your Zoom hand, or add questions in the chat. I had one thought, Judy, that I wanted to just raise, having to do with the concept of moral community. And I think about that concept as so relevant to our profession and what we do within academia and within our practice and training. And I had an experience many years ago of conducting a qualitative study with survivors of complex PTSD, and submitting the article to a journal, which eventually got published. But the focus was on the relational experiences of these survivors. And one of the reviewers came back, wrote the following, I'm going to paraphrase, the following comment, which was, well, how can we trust that these are truthful narratives, and how do we trust that what these women are telling us is actually true? And this was within a trauma journal, by the way, so
Mhm.
So you know what I'm talking about. And
Oh,
so,
I do.
I responded using their language, whatever language I thought they could hear, which was that, well, the clinicians who who made an assessment of the survivor's diagnosis found no evidence of a lack of reality testing. So I stuck with the diagnostic language.
Mhm.
Paper got published, but I kind of fell off my chair
Yeah, no.
reading these reviews. So I wonder if you could speak to the moral community within our professions, within academia, research, and so on.
Oi. Well, first of all, within our profession, you know, s- uh, and I'm speaking now psychiatry and and all the mental health professions. Um, the major source of treatment for major mental illness now is the prison system. The mental health system, we have tolerated seeing the mental health system basically taken over by corporate business practices and reduced to such total inadequacy that we have, along with our public health system, we now have epidemics not only of COVID, but of addiction, suicide, and gun violence. So, and in terms of the avoidance of engagement with trauma, more generally, given the prevalence of PTSD as in the general population, somewhere around 5% for men, 10% for women, you would think that trauma studies would be required in all academic programs. They are not. And if they are extraordinarily narrow in their focus. Really, I mean, I think what your reviewer was saying is that real trauma is combat trauma. These women, they're hysterical, they complain, they exaggerate, and so you have all the prejudices that afflict our larger community within academia as well. So we have our work cut out for us.
Thank you. I think, go ahead, Maggie, do you have your hand up? Yeah, please go ahead. We can't hear you. I'm not sure if you're muted. Do you want to type your question into the chat? And then I could read it if that would save some time. We can't hear you. Okay, if you would like to type it into the chat, please go ahead if it's possible for you.
No, she can't.
Sorry about that.
You do have a mute button in your lower left-hand corner. It looks like a little microphone and has a red line through it.
Is it just
Click
not
on that.
working?
It's not working. All right.
Okay. Oh, I think she's connecting to audio, maybe. Okay, we'll keep moving. Anybody else? Any other comments? Miriam, please go ahead.
I just wanted to express my appreciation, Judy, listening to you today. Early stages of my career, I worked next door to the Mock building at the Women's Alcoholism Program, and I attended the weekly training for years that VOV did, and it formed me, I would say. And it's so refreshing to hear you, kind of like what Usha said about just your clarity of purpose and focus is so refreshing and so powerful. And I just really want to thank you for your contributions.
Thank you. Thank you for those kind words.
Well, I think I can speak for all of us. Just a deep admiration for all of your work, Judy. And I imagine you know this, but it's worth saying this over and over again, that the impact of your work is tremendous and, cuts across generation and, and so many other dimensions. And I can't thank you enough for everything that you've given us and the people that we are working with and trying to help. So thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks everybody for being here. I know that we'll walk away feeling rich with thought and reflection.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Take care.